Well, hey there, everyone. It's Mrs. Acero here with another First Chapter Friday. It is officially my favorite month of the year. It is October. And of course, for October, we had to turn our minds into some spookier books that I think you will really enjoy. Today, I know you're going to love the one that I picked. It is by a very famous author, a comic book creator. He was the author of Coraline and Sandman and Stardust, and it is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Before we get into today's title, I want to make sure that you have a copy of your First Chapter Friday sheet. It's available for free in my video description, and you can print it out and keep them in your reader's notebook and fill them in so when it comes time for your next read, you'll have some titles to choose from. Okay, so be sure to grab that. So let's get into the Graveyard Book. Let's hear a little bit about it before we get started with chapter. Nobody Owens, known to his friends as Bod, is a normal boy. He would be completely normal if he didn't live in a sprawling graveyard, being raised and educated by ghosts, with a solitary guardian who belongs to neither the world of the living nor the dead. There are dangers and adventures in the graveyard for a boy, an ancient indigo man beneath the hill, a gateway to a desert leading to an abandoned city of ghouls, the strange and terrible menace of the Sleer. But if Bod leaves the graveyard, then he will come under attack from the man Jack, who has already killed Bod's family. Then it goes on to say, beloved master storyteller Neil Gaiman returns with a luminous new novel for an audience that embraced his best-selling novel, Coraline. Magical, terrifying, and filled with breathtaking adventures, the Graveyard Book is sure to enthrall readers of all ages. Now, I know that this is First Chapter Friday, and we usually read through the first chapter. This first chapter is extremely long, so I'll be reading part of the first chapter. Sometimes I actually, in different books, I have to read a few chapters based on length, but I'll read enough to give you a good taste of it. As we go along, I'll be sure to show you some of the illustrations as well. Okay, so let's get started with the Graveyard Book. Chapter 1, How Nobody Came to the Graveyard. There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. Great way to start a story, right? It's a good attention grabber. The knife had a handle of polished black bone and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to that house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. The street door was still open, just a little, where the knife and the man who held it had slipped in, and the wisp of a nighttime mist slithered and twined into the house through the open door. Some of these scary books really do a phenomenal job of setting the mood, right, with the description. The man, Jack, paused on the landing. With his left hand, he pulled a large white handkerchief from the pocket of his black coat, and with it he wiped off the knife and his gloved right hand, which had been holding it. Then he put the handkerchief away. The hunt was almost over. He had left the woman in her bed, the man on the bathroom floor, the older child in her brightly colored bedroom, surrounded by toys and half-finished models. That only left the little one, baby barely a toddler, to take care of. One more and his task would be done. He flexed his fingers. The man Jack was, above all things, a professional, or so he told himself, and he would not allow himself to smile until the job was completed. His hair was dark and his eyes were dark, and he wore black leather gloves of the thinnest lambskin. The toddler's room was at the very top of the house. The man Jack walked up the stairs, his feet silent on the carpeting. Then he pushed open the attic door and he walked in. His shoes were black leather and they were polished to such a shine that they looked like dark mirrors. You could see the moon reflected in them, tiny and half full. The real moon shone through the casement window. Its light was not bright, and it was diffused by the mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. The moonlight was enough. It would do. He could make out the shape of the child in the crib, head and limbs and torso. The crib had high, slatted sides to prevent the child from getting out. Jack leaned over, raised his right hand, the one holding the knife, and he aimed for the chest. And then he lowered his hand. The shape in the crib was a teddy bear. There was no child. The man Jack's eyes were accustomed to the dim moonlight, so he had no desire to turn on an electric light. And light was not that important after all. He had other skills. The man Jack sniffed the air. He ignored the scents that had come into the room with him, dismissed the scents that he could safely ignore, honed in on the smell of the thing he came to find. He could smell the child, a milky smell like chocolate chip cookies and sour tang of a wet, disposable nighttime diaper. He could smell the baby shampoo in its hair and something small and rubbery. A toy, he thought, and then, no, something to suck that the child had been carrying. The child had been here. It was here no longer. The man Jack followed his nose down the stairs through the middle of the tall, thin house. He inspected the bathroom, the kitchen, the airing cupboard, and finally the downstairs hall, in which there was nothing to be seen but the family's bicycles, a pile of empty shopping bags, a fallen diaper, and the stray tendrils of fog that had insinuated themselves into the hall from the open door to the street. The man Jack made a small noise then, a grunt that contained in it both frustration and also satisfaction. He slipped the knife into its sheath in the inside pocket of his long coat, and he stepped out onto the street. There was moonlight and there were streetlights, but the fog stifled everything, muted light and muffled sound, and made the night shadowy and treacherous. He looked down the hill towards the light of the closed shops, then up the street, where the last high houses wound up the hill on their way to the darkness of the old graveyard. The man Jack sniffed the air, then, without hurrying, he began to walk up the hill. Now, there's no picture, but I just want to show you. We have a little break, which indicates a lapse in time or scene. Ever since the child had learned to walk, he had been his mother's and father's despair and delight. For there never was such a boy for wandering, for climbing up things, for getting into and out of things. That night he had been woken by the sound of something on the floor beneath him, falling with a crash. Awake, he soon became bored and he had begun looking for a way out of his crib. It had high sides like the walls of his playpen downstairs, but he was convinced that he could scale it. All he needed was a step. He pulled his large golden teddy bear into the corner of the crib. Then, holding the railing in his tiny hands, he put his foot onto the bear's lap, the other foot up on the bear's head, and he pulled himself up into a standing position. And then he half climbed, half toppled over the railing and out of the crib. He landed with a muffled thump on a small mound of furry, fuzzy toys, some of them presents from relations from his first birthday, not 6 months gone, some of them inherited from his older sister. He was surprised when he hit the floor, but he did not cry out. If you cried, they came and put you back in your crib. He crawled out of the room. Stairs that went up were tricky things, and he had not yet entirely mastered them. Stairs that went down, however, he had discovered, were fairly simple enough. He did them sitting down, bumping from step to step on his well-padded bottom. He sucked on his number, the rubber pacifier his mother had just begun to tell him that he was getting too old for. His diaper had worked itself loose on his journey on his bottom down the stairs, and when he reached the last step, when he reached the little hall and stood up, the diaper fell off. He stepped out of it. He was only wearing a child's nightshirt. The stairs that led back up to his room and his family were steep, but the door to the street was open and inviting. The child stepped out of his house a little hesitantly. Fog wreathed around him like a long-lost friend, uncertainly at first. Then, with increasing speed and confidence, the boy pottered up the hill. Fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard, and look for that. You could see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors padlocked, ivy on the sides of the spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or a vole or a weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen these things in the moonlight if you had been there, right? You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates. And if you had seen her with a second, more careful, you would have realized that she was only moonlight mist and shadow. Plump, pale woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through a clutch of half-fallen tombstones toward the front gate. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 in the afternoon in the winter, at 8 at night in summer. Spike-topped iron railings ran past part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest of it. Bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old child. Owens, called the pale woman in a voice that might have been the rustle of the wind through the long grass. Owens, come and look at this. She crouched down and peered at something on the ground as a patch of shadow moved into the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife and then looked at what she was looking at, and he scratched his head. Mistress Owens, for he came from a more formal age than our own. Is that what I think it is? And at that moment, the thing he was inspecting seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth letting the rubber nipple it was sucking fall to the ground, and it reached out a small, tubby, as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Mrs. Owens' pale finger. Strike me silly, said Mr. Owens, if that isn't a baby. Of course it's a baby, said his wife, and the question is, what is to be done with it? I dare say that is a question, Mistress Owens, said her husband, and yet it is not our question. For this here baby is unquestionably alive, and as such is nothing to do with us, and is no part of our world. Look at him smile, said Mrs. Owens. He has the sweetest of smiles, and with one insubstantial hand she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. The chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place, for the graveyard covered the whole of the top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling, someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the old gates and the heavy padlock and the chain that held them. There now, said Owens, it's the babe's family come to bring him back. Leave the little man be, he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arms around the toddler, smoothing, stroking. Mrs. Owens said, he don't look like nobody's family, that one. The man in the dark coat had given up on rattling the main gates and now was examining the smaller side gate. It too was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. Come on, Mistress Owen, leave it be. There's a dear, said Mr. Owens when he saw a ghost, and his mouth dropped open, and he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did, you would be right, but Mr. Owen should not have taken on so at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead and had been for a few hundred years now, and given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also dead. But there was a difference between the folk of the graveyard and this, a raw, flickering, startling shape, the gray color of television static, all panic and emotion which flooded the Owenses as if it was their own. Three figures, two large, one smaller, only one of them was in focus, was more than an outline or a shimmer, and the figure said, my baby. He is trying to harm my baby. Clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy metal garbage can across the alley to the high brick wall that ran around that part of the graveyard. Protect my son, said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman. Of course, the babe's mother. What did he do to you? Asked Mrs. Owens, but she was not certain that the ghost could hear her. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake in due time in the place you were buried, to come to terms with your death, and to get acquainted with the other inhabitants. The creature was nothing but alarm and fear for her child, and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting attention, for other pale figures were coming from all over the graveyard. And I'm going to stop right there. I think that you will love this book. It is very kind of bone chilling. It is the perfect read for October. And I hope that you can find this at your public library. It was in my public library because he is a very famous author. So if you're interested, be sure to check it out. Thank you so much for joining me for First Chapter Friday. If you have any suggestions of books that you would like featured on my channel, I would love it if you could drop the title in the comments. Until then, I'll see you next Friday and happy reading.